Welcome to SLP Nerdcast, your favorite professional resource for evidence-based practice in speech-language pathology. I'm Kate Granbois.
And I'm Amy Wonka. We are both speech-language pathologists working in the field and co-founders of SLP Nerdcast.
Each episode of this podcast is a course offered for ASHA CEUs. Our podcast audio courses are here to help you level up your knowledge and earn those professional development hours that you need. This course, plus the corresponding short post-test, is equal to 1 certificate of attendance. To earn CEUs today and take the post-test after this session, follow the link provided in the show notes or head to slpnerdcast.com.
Before we get started, one quick disclaimer. Our courses are not meant to replace clinical advice. We do not endorse products, procedures, or other services mentioned by our guests unless otherwise specified.
We hope you enjoy the course.
Are you an SLP or related professional? The SLP Nerdcast Unlimited subscription gives members access to over 100 courses offered for ASHA CEUs and certificates of attendance. With SLP Nerdcast membership, you can earn unlimited CEUs all year at any time. SLP Nerdcast courses are unique, evidence-based, with a focus on information that is useful. When you join SLP Nerdcast as a member, you'll have access to the best online platform for continuing education in speech and language pathology. Join as a member today and save 10% using code NERDCASTER10. The link for membership is in the show notes.
Welcome to SLP Nerdcast, everyone. We are very excited for today's episode. We're already laughing. It's going to be a really great episode today. As most of our audience knows, Amy and I have worked as AAC, quote, AAC specialists for the majority of our career. And we are here today to talk about this topic, AAC, which is a real passion of ours. And we are here with 2 researchers and content experts, Dr. Kathy Binger and Nancy Harrington. Welcome, Kathy and Nancy.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Thanks very much. Glad to join you.
We're so excited for this conversation. We had some really nice chat before we hit the record button. But for those listeners who aren't familiar with your work, you're here to discuss AAC and developmental norms. And before we get started, can you please just tell us a little bit about yourselves?
Nancy, why don't you start us off?
Okay. I am a speech-language pathologist, clinician, and a researcher from the University of Central Florida. I have been working in the AAC field for nearly 40 years. I started my career in New York and also worked in Ireland for about 20 years and have been at UCF since 2013. Where I was very happy to join the research team of Dr. Binger and Dr. Kent Walsh. And we've got a lot of exciting stuff going on.
Great. Thanks, Nancy. And I'm Kathy Binger. I'm at the University of New Mexico, where I'm a professor. I'm also an SLP. And I want to make sure we give a very firm and loud shout out to Dr. Jennifer Kent Walsh, who's working at the University of Central Florida with Nancy, who's also, we're going to be talking about her work as well, because it's all of our work together. So, yeah, she couldn't be with us here today, but she's with us here in spirit. So
Shout out to Dr. Kent Walsh.
Yep.
We're so excited to get into everything. For our listeners who are not aware, we actually have hosted Dr. Binger and Dr. Kent Walsh on the show before to talk about AAC and language development. Today's episode is definitely not a replacement of that. It is very much an extension of that. But if anyone's listening and would like more information about AAC and how it intersects with language development, we will link that episode in the show notes as well. Before we do get into the good stuff, I need to read our learning objectives and financial disclosures. I will try and get through that as quickly as I can. Learning objective number 1 lists 3 reasons to use a developmental model in planning AAC intervention for children. Learning objective number 2, describe aspects of a developmental language framework when planning AAC intervention. And learning objective number 3, describe the benefits of ensuring access to both core and fringe vocabulary for aided communicators. Disclosures, Kathy's financial disclosures. Kathy is employed by the University of New Mexico and has funding from the National Institutes of Health. Kathy's non-financial disclosures. Kathy is a member of ASHA and Special Interest Group 12. Nancy's financial disclosures. Nancy is employed by the University of Central Florida and has funding from the National Institutes of Health. Nancy's non-financial disclosures. Nancy is a member of ASHA and ASHA Special Interest Group SIG 12. Kate, that's me. I'm the owner and founder of Grand Bois Therapy and Consulting, LLC, and co-founder of SLP Nerdcast. My non-financial disclosures, I'm a member of ASHA SIG 12 and serve on the AAC advisory group for Massachusetts Advocates for Children. I'm also a member of the Berkshire Association for Behavior Analysis and Therapy.
Amy's disclosures, that's me. My financial disclosures are that I am an employee of a public school system and co-founder of SLP Nerdcast. And my non-financial disclosures are that I am a member of ASHA. I'm in Special Interest Group 12, and I participate in the AAC advisory group for Massachusetts Advocates for Children. All right, let's get into the exciting stuff. Our first learning objective talks about the developmental framework. And I think, I work in a public school, I work in AAC. I'm working with a lot of people who don't necessarily have an understanding of typical language development. And I would love to hear you both talk a little bit about how important that is.
Well, it's very important. So, just as a starting point, I'll tell you, and this is Kathy, that, I go back over and 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 over again to the developmental model when I'm trying to figure out goals and objectives for kids who use AAC and also for kids who have developmental language disorder, kids who have whatever. Like, I go back to that model all the time and teach my students, hopefully, or teaching and learning are two different things, but at least try to teach my students the importance of doing that, because it helps us figure out where the gaps are, so that I know where this child I'm working with is doing relatively well and where their holes are. And for me to figure out where their holes are, I need to have an understanding of typical development. And am I going to make sure they're on track with all of the domains, pragmatic, semantic, syntax, etc., all at the same point at the same time? That's probably not going to happen with our kids, but I want to know where their relative strengths are as well as their relative weaknesses are, so that we can help boost those things up, because in language development, all of those things develop at the same time, right? And in our applying a developmental model paper, Amy, you were saying before we recorded that you really like the graphic that's in there. So I just want to call attention to that. If anybody wants to see that, you can look at our paper and look at that graphic. And it really tries to demonstrate how simultaneously these things are coming, right? Kids start to develop their pragmatic skills before they ever speak. And then they say their first words, and that's when semantics comes in. And then at about 18 months in typical development, that's when two-word combinations start, right? So by the time a typically developing kid is 18 months old and has 50 words, they're putting words together. That's syntax. They're starting to work on their syntax. So that's really early in development. 50 words isn't very many words. It's many words for kids with certain impairments, but for a lot of kids, that's not that many words. And so that's the beginning of syntax. That's the beginning of grammar. And we want to make sure that we're not ignoring one domain like syntax or morphology or grammar as a larger whole, while we're only working on something else like semantics, where we're, for example, in AAC trying to teach a kid how to find 500 words on their device. But meanwhile, we're not really focusing at the same time on helping them learn how to put those words together in a structural way, which is what we do see happening with kids who have, or kids in typical development. So we want to make sure we're supporting all those things at the same time, because that model really teaches us that kids can do that, and kids do that, and kids are cognitively ready for that if you're looking across these different stages. So Nancy, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah. And I think for all of you who are speech language pathologists providing language intervention, this doesn't sound very different, does it, to what you do with your children using natural speech to communicate? It's what I tell my students all the time. We're still doing language intervention. It's just that we're using additional tools and additional modalities to communicate. And I think that's so important for all of us as clinicians to remember.
I think one other piece that, as somebody who's working in the field and working with people who possibly didn't, I'm thinking of my like BCBA colleagues who I've worked with over the years, or maybe even OTs or PTs who don't get the instruction in developmental language that we do as speech language pathologists, is we'll also sometimes see that we're working on skills that are too many steps above. We've busted out of the zone of proximal development and we're like way down the hill. And then we're like, oh, why isn't this student able to do this? They can do these other things. So I think that's something else that for me at least has been very valuable in using that sort of developmental language lens to think about what the students I'm working with are doing or not doing. And often when I see we have somebody who's not achieving these objectives that we've set for them, we're missing there are gaps, like you were saying, like there's gaps that need to be filled in. And if we didn't kind of zoom back out and take a look with that lens, could have easily missed it.
I want to make a comment that's an extension of that. Um, in terms of working with AAC, like Nancy, when you said it's, we're still doing language intervention, I think it feels very different for a lot of clinicians because there's this thing, right? There's this like thing, and you're supposed to, and when you start working in AAC, and Amy and I, we were trained in this years ago, but one of the first things you have to learn is like, how do you program this thing? Like, what do you do physically with this thing? And I think that thing ends up inadvertently influencing what we end up doing in therapy, and it might even end up influencing the targets that we choose or the goals that we write. And this is, where I think we're going to kind of navigate into talking about this, this concept of vocabulary within this developmental model. I want to just give an example real quick. So a lot of the high-tech devices that we see often, they have, boards that are full of core vocabulary. And they might have a Fitzgerald key. Anybody who isn't familiar with that, you might be color coded, where the verbs are green and the nouns are color, and it's organized in this nice, in this beautiful way. And it's very tempting to leverage what the device can do or what the device can look like and try and map it onto our student or our client. And I think that there's a really interesting intersection there between this thing that just happens to be in the room and how it accidentally or might inadvertently influence the way we're thinking about our language intervention. I don't know if that's kind of like a springboard into talking about this, how we end up choosing what we're working on in therapy, or if you agree or disagree, feel free to tell me that I'm completely wrong 10,000%, because that happens a lot.
No, Kate, I'm really glad, you brought all of that up, and something that we've done a lot of talking about over the years is exactly what you said, is just getting over the thing, right? It's just a thing. It's a mode. That's all it is. And I think, especially when we're talking to SLPs who know language, and sometimes, we need a reminder of this or that, but, we were all taught typical language development at some point. And if you have this scary experience of, oh my gosh, there's this kid on my caseload now, and they're using this device and I don't know what to do, blah, 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 blah. To me, it's really comforting to think that my job is to go back to language, which is something that I know, right? So, one of the first things I always used to do when I was working in the schools or wherever I was working was, of course, going to the file to look at the IEP and look and see what goals and objectives are. I expect by and large, the goals and objectives for a child who's using AAC to be the same as a child who's using spoken language. The communication modes are expanded, but the objectives still need to be language-based. in general. I'm not saying you're never going to have one that's not, but that's what we do, is we help focus on language, and that's what AAC is supposed to do, and should do, is help build language skills.
But I think we also have a role as clinical educators and within the profession to help everybody to understand that and get over the thing, as we're calling it. I recently had a student talk about her experience in clinic with me, because she was seeing an AAC client in the university clinic. And she talked about how initially she was, fearful because of the technology and, learning all about that. But then she came to realize it's just about teaching language. It's not so different than what she's doing with other children. And I think that's something that we really need to hit home hard in as many different ways as we can. I think, and now I have a bit of scope to look back over, because I've been in the field for a number of decades across a couple of continents. But I think it's improving to some extent, because people are more familiar with technology than they were years ago. But we still have to get over it. And maybe it's very timely, as people are more familiar with technology, to help them really see it as just another modality.
Yeah, and it's never about, at the end of the day, there's no such thing, in my view and in my experience, as the perfect device or the one perfect solution. A lot of these solutions can do very similar things. It's all about what we do with it, and what we focus on, and using that, going back to that familiar, at least again for SLPs, that a familiar developmental model to help us figure out where the child is, where their strengths are, where their relative weaknesses are. It helps guide me, helps tell me where to go next and what to focus on next. Oh my gosh, we've been doing so much with building single word vocabulary. We've forgotten to work on syntax and work on these early word combinations and these rule-based combinations. And gosh, so we need to make sure we're also doing something to help facilitate that at the same time. And I just use that as one example, but I think that's a really common example that we see. Or we're focusing so much on pragmatic skills, or so much on requesting, even within a domain. Maybe we're focusing so much on requesting that we've forgotten about commenting and question asking and, other very, early developing communicative functions that are really important. So both within our domains as well as across our domains, using a developmental model can help remind us of the other components of language development and communication development that are happening.
And in one of the papers that we're going to link on the website, you are talking about the developmental approach, and you talk specifically about some of the different types of intervention approaches. I agree with you, Nancy. I think the thing is at least a little less scary now, because we all carry computers in our pockets. But some of the intervention approaches do feel a little different. They do feel a little different than if I was just using my oral speech. So maybe you could both talk to us just a little bit about some of those approaches and how that might look incorporating the thing, as we've called it.
Yeah. Nancy, do you want to start with that?
It's fine. So there could be various approaches in terms of looking at vocabulary. How are we going to choose the vocabulary? In the early days, you might have had, okay, we're going to have a whole bunch of nouns so that somebody can request. They can finally ask for what they want. Isn't this exciting? This is amazing. AAC is just so wonderful. So you might have a grid, whether it's a communication board or a static display device or a dynamic display device, where you have a whole bunch of maybe familiar toys and food and people. And isn't that wonderful? They can finally, request things. And so it's all that fringe vocabulary, looking at all those things that are within the environment that are important. And then maybe you add in then your verbs and your descriptive words and all those words that are associated with the context that you're playing in. So maybe we'll have an activity specific display which we've used a lot in our research, where we'll create a display that's set up with specific vocabulary for the routine. Now, it could be a play routine, it could be a mealtime activity, it could be a specific storybook, it could be any of those specific activities, but it's set up with diverse vocabulary across different parts of speech, but with the relevant vocabulary that's for that activity. So that rather than presenting the child with a really complicated setup initially where they have to think about the operational demands of navigating through lots of different pages, they have the vocabulary there, but it's set up in a way that they can create sentences. So we're looking at syntax. They can use varied vocabulary across different parts of speech. We have pronouns, we have nouns, we have verbs, we have adjectives, we have prepositions, we have morphological endings. Because, think about it, even, an 18 months to 2-year-old, an early 2-year-old is starting to add an ing to the end of their verbs. So we want to make sure that there's access for all of that. So we're teaching it in a little bit of an easier context so that the vocabulary is there for them, but they can, in fact, build sentences, build that syntax, use some more diverse vocabulary within their lexicon, and also talk about what's happening, during the play routine, whether it's to request something, whether it's to comment on something, whether it's, to ask where something is, whatever it might be. There's different options available. Now, that's not the be all to end all. We have, what happens when they want to talk about something tangential, and that grid is up there. So we have to think about that as well. So there are different approaches, and there are pros and cons to each of them, but we need to be thoughtful and think about how we apply them so that children have the opportunities to not only have access to vocabulary to communicate their most basic needs, but also to learn how to build that language, to learn how to, move from single words to 2-word utterances to increasingly more complex utterances with diverse vocabulary.
Yeah, and I want to go back to for a second, back to that noun-based vocabulary you were talking about, Nancy. So, I think for a lot of the kids we work with, when you're using a developmental model, going to a almost exclusively noun-based kind of an approach, that's not really warranted based on typical language development, right? Kids never go through a period of development where they're only using nouns. If you look at the first 50 words, again, using a developmental model, we go back to typical language development. The first 50 words that kids use, only about 50 or 60% of those words are nouns. They still have 40 to 50% of their words that are not nouns. They have social words, they have action words like up, they have all kinds of different, they have adjectives like hot and big. So, they have this diverse vocabulary, and you need that diverse vocabulary if you're ever going to combine words. You can't make sentences out of nouns. So, one of the things that we talk about in our developmental model paper is, as Nancy said, the pros and cons of each of these approaches. Some of them have more cons. If you're only using that approach. And this is something I'd love to hear from you, Kate and Amy, about what you think about this and what you've been exposed to with this. But in my world, and giving some of the talks that I've given, I've heard back from a lot of SLPs, and what I seem to hear a lot with kids who use AAC is that they tend to be getting just one approach. And so that's when I think, and I understand why life is hard, and there are all these real world complications that we need to be taking into an account. And that's another topic we probably should get into, because we still have way more progress to make in the world of intervention to bring all these things together. But anyway, where I was originally headed with this is that, when if we put ourselves in a box and we only take one approach and only that approach, so only noun-based system, or almost exclusively noun-based system, or exclusively an activity specific kind of display, or that Nancy was talking about, where we have a page for playing with cars and a page for playing with cooking or whatever. If that's the only thing they get, then we're going to end up in trouble at some point. So I think, really the next phase, I hope, of where we're going is with doing a better job of taking this developmental model into account and finding solutions where we can bring these things together. We can be working short term, for example, on building those early sentences and phrases and clauses like we do with our activity specific displays in our research, which have been around forever, by the way. Like, we didn't create these, they've been around forever. And then people threw them out because kids have to, go to a page for vehicles every time they want to say crash, but maybe they're talking about crashing something else, right? Like, it doesn't make sense. But so you can't just if you just have one approach, then you're going to get stuck. If you only have a really complicated display where there are thousands of pre-programmed words, and from the start, you're trying to teach a kid to put words together using that, it's going to probably take them quite some time because there's a very real cognitive load there. So I don't know if all of this is making sense or not, but there's a way to go with what we need to do. And then we also need to be making some decisions right now before we have all these better kind of solutions that are out there. And right now, I think the best that we can do is, make sure that we sometimes are focusing on syntax and grammar and building those utterances. And Nancy and I just finished 2 randomized controlled trials where we've just spent the last 5-6 years working on that with a couple different groups of preschoolers. And at the same time, we need to be building vocabulary, and we want to be putting vocabulary in a permanent place where kids can find it over the long term, right? Like, all of these things are going on, and trying to figure out how to do it all isn't the easiest thing in the world, but knowing and being honest about, where we are and where our gaps are going to help guide us in terms of filling in those gaps.
And it goes back to diagnostics. What do we look at when we see a client walk into our clinic? Where are they developmentally? What do they need to communicate about? What context do they need to communicate in, and with who? And how are we going to assist them with that? And that all has to be looked at within the context of where the child's at developmentally. And that's really what we have to think about and be thoughtful of, considering all the different approaches and different types of vocabulary selection. We need to make sure that the children we're working with have access to the rich vocabulary that typically developing children have, and that we're not limiting them based on the thing, as we said earlier.
Yeah. So Kate and Amy, what are your thoughts?
I was just about to say, I think that AAC is one of these scopes of our practice. It's an area that is complex, right? I mean, it's assessment, the variables that we have to look at and the questions that we have to ask are intertwining. A lot of the individuals that we work with in AAC, not just myself and Amy, but just generally speaking, we're talking about complex communication needs. We might be talking about complex bodies. We might be talking about a lot of complexity. And for me, and this is my opinion, this is just my opinion, when I hear, I'm going back to your earlier question, Kathy, do we see kids who get just one or the other? So do we see kids who tend to get just core or just fringe? In my experience, the answer is yes. I do see that happening. I think the opinion that I very quietly just put on the shelf, but I'll pull back out, is that anytime in intervention, if you're approaching the problem with a one size fits all approach, there is I'm going to hold my breath, like this is a red flag for me. Right. And I do see it in AAC, but not just with, well, we're just giving a core approach and we're just giving a fringe approach. I also hear, well, we do touch chat here. This is just what we do here, right? So there is a lot of status quo culture that I find, and this is my opinion, comes into play when people are making decisions about intervention strategies, targets that they choose. And I think it's, not necessarily the fault of the speech pathologist. It could be the professional workplace culture. It could be lack of resources for training, because this is genuinely a complex area of clinical expertise. Amy, I don't know if you have a different experience or, agree or disagree.
I agree. I agree with a lot of what you're saying. I mean, I can say personally, like I started off in the field. We were talking about this before we hit record, but I started off in the field as a teacher's aide in the 90s. We used PECs. It was exactly what you described, Nancy, which was like, oh my, isn't this amazing? Now we can ask for all the things. This is huge. And it is. It's huge to see somebody go from not having access to any of that to being able to request all of these specific things. But then I was in school at the time. I was going back to school for speech pathology. There are inherent weaknesses when you try and map an all fringe or all core system onto developmental framework. It's very hard. I mean, in reading your paper, it's very hard to generate a simple narrative with a very limited subset of vocabulary, right? So then I went to conferences. I learned about core vocabulary. I was like, yes, this is the answer. You can't make a 2-word combination without core. This is key. And I sort of got really enthusiastic in the other direction. And Kate, to come back to your point, yes, obviously it is one approach is never the best approach for everybody. And finding a more measured place in the middle is obviously where I have settled, in my current practice. I do think, there's also this other layer, which is wanting to give people access to a really robust system. And Nancy, Kathy, as you guys were talking about the activity displays, I think sometimes we feel like on the one hand, it's complicated by time and people having time to do these things and create these different displays. So that's a limiting factor there. But I'm just thinking, we really don't do that. And it doesn't have to be either or. Like it doesn't have to be you have access to word power and all of this vocabulary. So we can't try an activity-based display to give you an opportunity to like relieve some of that navigational
that's right.
burden and work
Right.
on morphology. Like it doesn't have to be one or the other. And I think that's a piece that every time I read something like your paper, I'm like, that's right. It's the combination of all of these things. Um,
I
so
have
yeah,
a
I don't know if
both
that answers your
and
question.
slide that I put up when whenever we give these talks of it doesn't need to be one or the other. It can be both. And again, like it's complicated. Everybody doesn't have, no one has all the time in the world, blah, 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 all that stuff. And like you can use for a child for whom it's appropriate, a more complicated kind of system with lots of words, blah, blah, blah. And, as you can develop some activity displays in specific motivating activities where somebody can be helping to facilitate those word combinations, the clausal development, the phrasal development, you are in all likelihood going to see that kid make way more progress with their syntax development and their grammar development and their morphological development, if they can just have sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes for certain activities, an activity specific display where they don't have to be hunting for other things. They can just focus right here. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, we just finished, 2 long studies where we're getting both of them out the door right now. And so we'll come back on if you want at some point to talk to you in detail about those 2 very large studies. And, we just saw kids, not only kids with typical receptive language, which I know is the minority of kids who use AAC. We did do one study with kids with typical receptive language and also a study with kids with Down syndrome. And in both cases, we saw them make substantial gains in their length of utterance, over a 4-month period of time, where, they really were probably pretty stagnant with that beforehand, and they didn't have access to AAC anyway before that for most of them. So yeah, we can do a lot, but it doesn't have to be all day, every day they're doing one thing.
And I also want to note that, we can consider this too with, many of our AAC users who use alternative access. Yes, it might take more time. It might be slower for them to select the vocabulary that they want. But even though they may not be able to produce so many different symbols at once within a set period of time, we still have to consider developmentally, where are they? What vocabulary do they need access to? How can we set up their devices and their displays so they have access to the lexical and vocabulary diversity so that they can produce a range of utterances and learn to use syntax and grammar?
I think that's such a good point too. And it makes me think about, just back to this. What did you say? Yes, and or both and,
Both
but
and, yeah.
both and. So because there are also times when that's the purpose of the activity, right? So back to operational demands, whether that's because you are using switch scanning or something, it's a more cumbersome access method, or because you're learning to navigate your system and that's a cumbersome access method for you in the moment. Um, Sometimes the focus of the activity is to work on that morphology, and sometimes it's not, right? So I think also being flexible within kind of what areas, I mean, back to that figure that I really like in the paper, but just thinking about, there's different things that are happening at the same time within those different developmental bands, and it doesn't mean we have to be working on the highest level of performance of all of those things simultaneously either.
That's right. That's right. Like to have, a couple activities a week where you're really honing in on the sentence development, the phrasal development, the clausal development, whatever, putting those words together in a rule-based way. But that doesn't mean you're doing that all day, every day, right? Yeah, there are times and places for these things. And different access methods even, that you may use for to make things easier so that they can focus more on the learning of this rather than this in a particular moment.
And that's the beauty of a lot of our new technology, is that burden can be more on the technology and less on the user. And then back to your point as well, that we need to consider all aspects of language. We need to consider the semantics, the pragmatics, I think back to years ago when I first went to graduate school. I remember learning about Bloom, Leahy, and form, content, and use. Those 3 circles that intersected and all went together. And it's still relevant. We have to be thinking about that all, with our clients that we're working with. We have to think about all aspects of language from a developmental perspective.
I wonder if now is a good time for us to talk a little bit about the other paper that we're going to link in the show notes, and just talk a little bit more about kind of that division between the core vocabulary and the fringe vocabulary and how that's used and how that intersects with the developmental piece.
You betcha. Let's do it. So, before we go down that road too much, I made a little note. I want to touch back on something that's related. As I'm shaking my clothespin at you. I know, we all have our sensory things that we do. So anyway, Kate, you had mentioned, that anytime you see like everyone taking the same approach, that sets bells and whistles off for you, right? If everybody's doing the same thing. I want to say I don't know where we're heading with all of this, but I do also understand that sometimes that happens because, sometimes people don't know what else to do. Sometimes people have a whole classroom that's of really complex kids with, not necessarily a whole lot of help or a whole lot of background in what they're doing. And it's not necessarily AAC isn't their, huge specialty. Like there are all these things that are these very, very, very practical, real world pressures that are out there on working clinicians, working educators, educational assistants, all these folks who are trying to just do the best job that they can with what they have. So, looking down the road, I really hope, think that the next phase of what we're going to be looking at is taking those things more into consideration than we are right now with most of our interventions, and so that we can be doing the kinds of things that we're talking about today and doing it in a practical kind of way. So, yeah, so that then takes us, do you want to ask us a question about the paper we wrote on core and fringe vocabulary, or do you just want Nancy and I to launch into it?
I think it would be really helpful to hear what the data is showing and what direction the science is pulling us in. If I love that vignette that you just painted of like, where are we headed with this?
Yeah.
Knowing that looking backwards, we started in a place with AAC where it was like, oh my gosh, we can use symbols. Oh my gosh, people can request things. This is amazing. And then it was, oh my gosh, look at the power of core. And we've gone all the way into core. So where is I would love to know like where the science is taking us next. And I think that's a really important conversation, not only because of the real world limitations that people face in terms of resources and time and knowledge gaps, but also I find that this topic gives people a lot of feels. There are a lot of feels that come with talking about how to choose vocabulary with AAC. And that is not a judgment. That is, everybody's allowed to, I'm here to validate everyone's feelings. Everybody's feelings are valid and it is okay.
I feel okay, Kate.
Okay, okay, good. But I think that taking a look at what we know versus what we don't know is a really nice way to unpack those feelings.
I could not agree with you more. And so I want to start really zoomed out here, which is something that I just see and hear, here and there in the AAC world is that, quote unquote, we know so much about core vocabulary. And that's a place where I will take a firm stand and say, no, we do not. We do not know much at all about core vocabulary. We know how to create word frequency lists. We're really good at that. There are lots of word frequency lists out there, and people are constantly publishing more and more lists. And that's what core vocabulary is, and the way that we define it in AAC are words that are used frequently across a group of people, right? So preschoolers in home settings and in daycare settings, or or in school settings, or whatever it is, right? So that's core vocabulary. We have a number of research papers that are out there on establishing core vocabulary lists, but we don't have many empirical research studies beyond that. So that was really the impetus for the paper that we just recently published on core vocabulary, fringe vocabulary, the combination. So the context for the paper is that we decided to look at fairly young kids. They're 2.5 years old. We got our hands on there are wonderful online databases now of transcripts that you can do all kinds of analyses. So we found a good set of transcripts from kids who were 2.5 years old. We had, I want to say about 60 kids and about well over 100 transcripts that we analyzed. And these kids were at daycare settings and in home settings. And they were talking both with a parent as well as with, in the classroom. So they had, they were doing they were doing recordings of them. So not all day recordings, but they were doing recordings in both places. So anyway, so it was a really nice pool of language samples. And what we did with these typically developing kids, our big question was, how is core vocabulary and how is fringe vocabulary being used in the real utterances of these kids? Right? So if you just take then we ended up with over 10,000 utterances that we did our initial analysis on. And we looked at the percentage of utterances that of these 10,000 utterances, what percentage of them consisted only core vocabulary? What percentage of these utterances consisted of only fringe? And what percentage of these utterances consisted of both? And then we looked at 6 different core vocabulary lists. They're all English. We didn't look at any other languages. We just looked at English to see what was in our samples were all English speaking kids. And what we found was that, well, first of all, with these 6, stop me if I'm like going into too much detail and wave at me or something and back off. But to give you the context, there are 6 lists that we looked at. 2 of them were very, very short. 2 of the lists were the Banerjee list that has 23 words that's frequently used. There's another list that's universal core that's being used for, especially for kids who have very significant multiple disabilities in some classrooms, and that list only has 36 words on it. And, that list in particular was made with the thought that, it's used for whole classrooms. These are the same 36 words that are given to all the kids, is my understanding. And, these kids there's not a lot of real estate they can get access to. So how do we make the most out of the real estate that they have, right? The thought behind it is an excellent one for sure. And then the other 4 lists were much longer. They were at least 250 words. Okay. So what we saw with what percentage of these 10,000 utterances consist of only core vocabulary, for that 36 word universal core, it was only 5% of their utterances consisted of only that universal core vocabulary. So very, very, very few utterances. And those utterances tended to be very, very short. We also did MLU. We have MLU figures on all this stuff. They were very short utterances and they didn't have a whole lot of content in them, as you might imagine, because, there were only 36 words. The other short list, the Banerjee, sorry, I'm so sorry. I never know how to say that name. My apologies. That list was 22% of those 10,000 utterances were core only, but over 85% of them, or it was 85% of them, were made up of yes and no. So almost all of them were yes and no. So basically, those lists perform very similarly in that there are very, very few utterances that those kids were saying outside of yes and no that consisted of only core vocabulary, which the take-home message there for me is kids are not using only core vocabulary when they're talking. Even at 2.5 years old, they're not just using core vocabulary. They're using the fringe too. So, I won't get into the details of all the graphs, but you can see in our paper that, you get, there's some utterances that are only core, some are only fringe, and some are both. And then you can look at the samples of them, and what those utterances look like are dramatically different depending on if you're looking at a core only utterance, a fringe only utterance, or a core and fringe. And no surprise, the ones with core and fringe were way longer and way more complex than the utterances that were made up of only core or the utterances that were made up of only fringe. So it's kind of a flashback for those of us, all 4 of us have been around in the field for a long time. Like I learned back in the 90s that, we need to be using core vocabulary and fringe vocabulary, but to my knowledge, nobody's really looked objectively at what that really means and what our kids' utterance is really made out of. Emily Laubscher and Janice Light did a nice study. They looked at core vocabulary through the lens of the MacArthur Communication Development Inventory and had, they found, of course, like there's not enough content if you're just looking at the core lists. And this is just looking at that same issue through a different lens where we see that. And if you look at the mean length of utterance, for the samples that we took, it's what we really expected, which is again, that those utterances that have both core and fringe are way longer and way more complex than the utterances that are only consisting of core or only consisting of fringe. So the take-home message is, guess what? Kids need both core and fringe if they're going to be making the most of their language skills. So that's my intro to all of that.
So what I'm hearing you say is that kids need more. Your study was on non-AAC users,
That's
so
right.
children,
Typically
typical
developing
children using oral speech. And kind of circling back to our previous conversation, looking at the importance of pinging our clinical thoughts and questions back to a developmental model and sort of, really embracing this developmental model. What we now know based on this study, and it sounds like the data was pretty clear, what typically developing children who use oral speech are producing, by far and large, are utterances of both core and fringe.
Well, percentage wise, so for the longer vocabulary list, the ones that were at least 250 words, the core list that were at least 250 words, about 50% of their utterances were made up of only core vocabulary, but they had a lot more words to pick from, right? Like if you have a much larger corpus that you're starting with and that the kids, I mean, I shouldn't say have access to because, these were typically developing kids, but if you give a kid all 250 words on the Buchelman list, he's going to have a much better shot at putting together some decent utterances, right? Like 2-3 word utterances. You're going to get, what do we end up with, an MLU of, 2.2 to 2.5 with those longer lists. Okay, so you get a substantial number of utterances that are only core, but contrast that MLU wise, right? Mean length of utterance wise, with that Buchelman list, we saw, okay, on average, the length of utterance for if they have just, or made up of just the Buchelman core vocabulary, they have an MLU of 2.2. Well, if you look at the core and fringe utterances, right? The utterances that had both core and fringe vocabulary in them, their MLU was at 4.6. So we went from 2.2 to 4.6. And that was consistent across all the longer lists. Like we saw exactly the same pattern. The numbers changed a tiny bit, but exactly the same patterns where, a typically developing 2.5-year-old has an MLU of 2.5 or 3. They're getting way higher when they're using all those different words versus just a small subset of that core vocabulary. So yeah, it did depend on the kind of list, but it was really like what's going on with those longer lists versus what's going on with those shorter lists. Those shorter lists, especially one of them, was really doing the kids no favors at all. Like they couldn't say anything with those. We have a whole list in the article. We have a very long appendix that has samples of, it has all the samples that we used to analyze the MLU data. And you can see for yourself what those utterances were that we randomly sampled from that big 10,000 utterance corpus. And they're very stark. And if you want, I can read a few off to you if that's of interest. But so anyway, it varied depending on the list, but the message was still the same.
Well, and it makes me think back to our earlier conversation just about the developmental language component there. And if we're thinking of 50 or fewer than 50 words, and then you had mentioned that of those first 50 words, about 50 to 60% of those are nominals, they're fringe words, and then the remaining 40 or 50% are core words. I mean, the research doesn't always make sense and like jive with what seems logical, but in this case it sounds like it does, in the sense that if you're going to have, because our students are all individual, and you may have motor access or visual complexity that necessitates a smaller amount of vocabulary, at least to start off. But I think, for me as a clinician, hearing you talk about that, it makes me think it's almost more important to have that balance the smaller your vocabulary is.
Yeah, I mean, if all you have, like, let's take this as an example. You said, Amy, earlier, you were so excited when you learned about core vocabulary initially because kids had different parts of speech that they need to build sentences, right? But some of those lists, especially the tiny ones, some of them have no nouns on them at all. Like, so you may have the word "an" like as an article, but you need a noun to attach it to. Like, and you may have he or she or it, but it doesn't do you much good if you don't have a referent that you can first refer to. And maybe you can do that by pointing, right? Maybe there are some multimodal ways, but from a developmental perspective, and Nancy, I promise I'll give you a chance to talk here. just like wind me up and off I
It's
go.
fine. Keep going. You're doing
Okay,
great.
so words like this or that, which are very common on even the shortest core vocabulary list. So those are very, very useful words, right? What do you want? I say this while I'm pointing at something or touching something, and I say that while I point at something that's across the room. Those are incredibly useful words. They're very powerful words. They are also indicative in kids with spoken language disorders of a language disorder because they use those words to cover all kinds of territory. They point to, you know, the pink monkey when they want the pink monkey. What do you want? That. I want that. Like you hear kids with, preschoolers with language disorders say this stuff all the time, but what they should be learning to say and need to learn to say is the pink monkey, right? Like that's part of development. So, we don't want to be teaching our kids to overuse those things. We don't have to. In terms of language development, it teaches us that we need to be helping them to learn those words and fill in and using those more precise words so that they can develop, again, that phrasal and clausal and sentence kind of development.
Absolutely. And we also need to think about the different types of words, because what we do often with core is perhaps we might have the verb eat. And there might be something very specific that the child wants to eat. Maybe they want to eat cake. No, maybe they want cookies. Maybe they want chicken nuggets. Maybe they want pizza. Maybe they want applesauce. Or maybe they want to eat somewhere else. Maybe they want to go out to eat. But all they have there is eat. They have nothing else. And that's not what we do with how typically developing children learn language and express themselves. And what we're doing is we're kind of almost teaching these meta-linguistic skills to try to figure out how you can use one word to say lots of different things. But we're not providing the vocabulary for those building blocks of language.
Yeah, I think that's something that goes overlooked, and I'd love to hear what Kate and Amy think about this too, that, if you give kids a very, very, very limited set of vocabulary and that's all they have, they're often taught to use that vocabulary in ways that no one else uses that vocabulary, right? And to cover like, let's take the word go, right? So I use the word go not just for as I normally would, but I might use it for, being in a car and moving forward. I might use it for, I don't know, all kind walking. I might use it for running. I might use it for sprinting. Everything is go. And if everything is go, it's so imprecise and we can teach kids to use it in ways that nobody else really does. And then as Nancy said, like that can potentially really create meta-linguistic demands on them. And it's not part of typical development. So Kate and Amy, have you experienced like that kind of thing and this kind of very odd use of vocabulary that you see sometimes when kids only have access to very limited vocabulary?
I feel like yes and no. I think one area that I'm thinking about is just the descriptive teaching approach. So using, maybe tier 2, tier 3 curriculum vocabulary, and then recasting that back using core or, tier 1 type fringe vocab.
Yeah.
I think that can be helpful. I think that that's a helpful intervention approach. Not only just to shift sort of the way that we're teaching, but also to get people to really think about the definitions that they're giving students who probably might not have room on their AAC system for that like tier 2, tier 3 vocab. I do think back in the day in the 90s and early 2000s. Yeah, I mean, I think that's sort of that was my takeaway. And it could have been, I took away the wrong message from some of the PD that I did. But my takeaway was sort of, you're better off teaching that sort of less typical phraseology because it could be more versatile. And I think now the more nuanced way that I would look at it, particularly through the developmental lens, would be like, okay, but is that a clinical choice that I'm making because we have actual real limitations on system size for this particular person? Because I do think that is true for some communicators. And that might be where you think about that, like you were saying, Kathy, with the this and that, like, okay, if this person, I mean, one thing that pops up on systems is like hi and bye. Well, if you are able to move your
Wave.
body and
Yeah.
gesture like that, perhaps we can give that real estate to something else. Kate,
Yeah.
I don't know if you've seen sort of that funny utterances as a result of limited access to vocab.
I definitely have, and I think I've seen it play out in a couple of different ways. One of the things, so I tend to work with, emergent communicators, and one of the things that I have seen quite often is an over reliance or a clinician over relying on core when the situation that you've just described, and having the concern that these are very ambiguous terms, right? So
Yeah.
the go looks running looks different when, even just a verb, running looks different when you do it than when I do it, when it's slow or when it's fast, or within different contexts. And I think that there, is definitely, I've seen some issues growing out of this limited approach where we have, you know, we're not really acquiring a lot of, there's really, really slow progress, if any progress at all. And then the recommendation is, well, we're not modeling enough, or there isn't enough immersion. And, there might not be enough attention paid to some significant executive functioning components or sensory needs that are kind of mapped onto this. I also see the limited vocabulary and rigidity play out in terms of making almost the swinging in the complete opposite direction, making things entirely too specific. So, choosing vocabulary that means something to that particular individual, but outside of this educational context, no one is going to know what this one tiny thing is. I think that the decisions that get made for vocabulary, um, they tend to be, like, going back to the beginning of our conversation, really heavily influenced by so many other variables, based on the context and the environment and the workplace culture and knowledge gaps and all kinds of stuff. And it's not great when it's limited in either direction.
Yeah, well, and there's another factor, we're talking about variables that all that made me think about, which is motivation. When little kids learning language is really exciting. They love words. Kids who we're talking about, kids who are symbolic, and kids who are have that cognitive ability and blah blah blah, who are learning more words. And being able to say, again, let's go back to our vehicles routine, and saying go for everything every time you're moving a vehicle is one thing, but being able to say crash is another thing altogether, right? And then laughing, like you see kids like crash, just being able to talk about that, and even to little tiny things. Well, yeah. So I'll just put a ending on that, like that, looking at how motivating vocabulary is in different contexts, I think is something to remember. If you ever get a chance to just look at typically developing little kids and the vocabulary that they're using and that they're so excited about. And that reminds me of another point that we haven't talked about yet, which is grammatical morphemes. Nancy mentioned earlier that we give kids access to those early on, depending on where they are in that developmental using that developmental model again. And I think we tend to think about grammatical markers as fluff, right? Like, why would you take up real estate with something like an ing? And Amy, I see you nodding your head very vigorously.
Yes, vigorous nod.
The fact is, at least in part, little kids start using grammatical morphology so early because it's really useful. Like, even take something like a versus the, right? Something indefinite versus definite. There's two very different meanings to those two words. Or plural versus singular. There's a big difference between cookie and cookies.
It's a lot of fun to ask for cookies.
That's right. It's a lot more fun to ask for cookies. So, that using that developmental model helps remind us of when that comes in and how early that comes in. So what were you thinking, Amy, when I was talking about that?
I was just thinking it was a good example of one of those funny gaps I was talking about. We might be working receptively on find the plural, find the cookies, find the crayons, but we've never worked on it expressively. So that student didn't even have access to play around with that concept
Yeah.
like they would have if we had. So yeah, I had big head nod feelings, but I think because so much of it is also tied to bigger concepts, right? It's tied to when we think about verb tense markers, that's also tied to ideas about time. And
Absolutely.
that's such a
Right.
piece about narratives and being able to talk
Yeah.
about something that's happening, already happened, is going to happen. Like there's all these funny, and I'm guilty of the like that's fluff and shouldn't take up space, by the way. So like if
Yeah.
anybody's listening
We
and
have
feeling bad
limited,
about that.
right. We don't want to, Nancy and I have been very spoiled, at least in our research, and this has been a choice of working with kids who are direct selectors and who don't have, who can access a number of symbols using direct selection. And a lot of you out there are working with kids for whom that is not the case. So I don't want to in any way minimize the challenges of working with kids who have really significant access issues. And you do have to maximize use of that real estate. I just think that we're not, well, I'll save this point I'll make my mic drop moment now. We're not done, people.
I love it.
We're not done. We're like, I think about the quote all the time about looking at things with dispassionate objectivity, right? Like, where are we as a discipline? As soon as we think we're done growing and as soon as we think we know everything, we're toast. So there's so much we don't know about how these things work over time and how to best facilitate what's going on with these kids and how to merge all the real life issues of working with kids in whatever setting that are very challenging and very challenging, and that we need to be working with our instructors and our teachers and our educators and our speech language pathologists to help develop interventions and have their input so that what we meaning researchers, are developing is truly useful for them because we built it with them and we have so much growth to do in that area. So I don't want to gloss over all of that. That stuff is so profoundly important. And so is using a developmental model to help us know where we're best supporting these kids and where their gaps are.
Well, I think that was a wonderful way to kind of tie it all up. I think that you just nailed it. Mic drop, we're done. I think that's it. I really just appreciate this entire conversation. And I want to second the importance of just acknowledging that we don't know what we don't know, and that research is, sometimes it's limited. Sometimes there are practices or things that we're doing where, there isn't, it's evidence informed, but we don't have 20 years of empirical data yet. Right. And I really appreciate just pointing out that we're going places, right? Oh, the places we'll go we're not done.
That's right. That's right. And we're just figuring out what questions we should be asking about some of these things. We just can't get complacent.
Well, thank you both so much for being here. This was a really wonderful conversation, and we hope you'll come back.
I'll always come back. What about you, Nancy?
It's been a pleasure.
No pressure, no pressure. Thanks again. This was really great.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate everything that you do.
For sure. Thanks so much for helping to get the word out.
Thank you so much for joining us in today's episode. As always, you can use this episode for ASHA CEUs. You can also potentially use this episode for other credits depending on the regulations of your governing body. To determine if this episode will count towards professional development in your area of study, please check in with your governing bodies, or you can go to our website, www.slpnerdcast.com. All of the references and information listed throughout the course of the episode will be listed in the show notes. And as always, if you have any questions, please email us at info@slpnerdcast.com. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to welcome you back here again soon.